Welcome back to part 14 of our Masterclass Explainer. Today, we're putting on our clinical detective hats to unravel the incredibly specific ICD-10-CM rules for subsequent myocardial infarctions and category I22. Now, if you've been following along with us, you know that cardiac coding, it's all about absolute precision. So we're going to look at exactly what happens when a patient's recovery is suddenly interrupted by a second, brand new infarction.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the 28-day healing window, look at the pairing rules for category I22, go over some strict exclusion restrictions, apply the sequencing matrix logic, and then finish up with a few real-world case studies to really test your knowledge. Let's get to it. Section 1. The 28-day healing window, our critical coding countdown. We're starting with arguably the most crucial timeframe in cardiac coding, a period where the standard rules, well, they're temporarily suspended. Understanding this countdown is literally the foundation of everything we're discussing today. Day 0 marks the moment that initial acute MI occurs. Then, for the next 1 to 3 weeks, the patient is in the active healing phase. Now, here's the kicker. If a patient suffers a new myocardial infarction at any point along this 4-week, 28-day timeline, it triggers a very specific set of category I22 logic rules. Once that 28-day window closes, things change. But inside it, we've got a strict countdown to follow. Section 2, category I22 pairing rules, the mandatory tether. So how does this timeline build into the absolute law of category I22? Well, this code is completely unique because it's specifically designed to never, ever stand alone. Category I22 essentially acts like a flashing beacon. It signals that a second, totally distinct cardiac event has occurred right in the middle of the active healing phase. It instantly tells any reviewer looking at that chart, hey, this patient didn't just have one heart attack, they actually suffered a second one while still recovering from the first, all within that critical 4-week window. I like to think of I22 as that clingy friend who always needs a buddy. Step 1 is, of course, assigning the I22 code for the new subsequent MI. But step 2? Absolutely non-negotiable. You must tether it to the category I21 code for the initial MI. This mandatory pairing paints a mathematically precise picture of the patient's active cardiac timeline. You just can't have one without the other. Section 3, I22 exclusion restrictions, strict type requirements. Now, keep in mind, category I22 is a highly exclusive club. It has very strict entry criteria based on the exact type of myocardial infarction. You can't just slap it onto every subsequent heart issue. The exclusions here are incredibly strict. Check this out. If the subsequent MI is a type 2, meaning it's due to demand ischemia, you never assign I22. No way. You must only use I21.A1. And the same exact rule applies for subsequent type 4 or 5 AMIs. You're only going to use I21.A9. Category I22 is strictly, exclusively reserved for subsequent type 1 or unspecified acute myocardial infarctions. So what happens if you mix MI types within that 4-week window? You completely bypass I22. If an initial type 1 MI is followed, say, 3 weeks later by a type 2 MI from demand ischemia, the I22 rule is basically thrown out the window. You just stick to the appropriate I21 categories for each specific event. Section 4, sequencing matrix logic, principal versus secondary diagnosis. Okay, so we know the codes and we know the restrictions, but how do we sequence them? Well, it all boils down to where the patient is when that second MI strikes, and more specifically, what drove the admission in the first place. Let's look at the algorithmic logic here. Think of it as asking yourself, why did the patient walk through the hospital doors? In scenario 1, inpatient progression, they came in for the first MI, and the second one happened during the same stay, so I21 stays in the principal slot. But in scenario 2, they were discharged and then readmitted specifically for a new MI within 28 days. Because that new event drove the readmission, I22 takes the principal diagnosis spot and I21 drops to secondary. Now let's add one more layer to this. What if they're admitted for a totally unrelated condition, like pneumonia, and then they suffer that subsequent MI while receiving care? In this case, the unrelated condition, the pneumonia, is your principal diagnosis. Both your I22 and I21 codes will drop down to secondary positions, always sequence based on the primary reason for the encounter. Section 5, real-world case studies, testing the logic. Now it's time to put this matrix to the test with some real-world scenarios straight from our coding clinics. Applying these rules practically is really the only way to master them for sure.
Here's case A. A patient's admitted with an acute left main coronary artery STEMI. A week later, he experiences a new acute anterolateral STEMI during that exact same hospital stay. Think back to our inpatient progression rule. If this happens during the same stay before they've even been discharged, how are we sequencing this?
If you guessed I21.01 as the principal, you hit the nail on the head. Because the initial left main STEMI is what actually drove the admission, it remains the principal diagnosis. The new event becomes your secondary I22.0 code. You tether the two together and boom, you've told the full clinical story of that single hospital stay. Let's move to case B. This time, our patient with an anterolateral STEMI is discharged, but they return just 1 week later, still within that 28-day window, with severe chest pain that's diagnosed as a brand new inferior wall STEMI. What happens to our sequencing now that it's a readmission? Right, the logic perfectly flips. Because the subsequent inferior wall STEMI is the driving reason for this brand new admission, I22 takes the principal diagnosis spot. It's still tethered to the original I21 code, but now that original MI sits in the secondary diagnosis position. Last one, case C. What code should be assigned when a patient is readmitted with a new type 2 acute MI occurring within 4 weeks of a previous acute MI? This is a huge trap that so many coders fall into, so let's test your memory on those strict exclusion restrictions we covered earlier. And here's the answer. For any subsequent type 2 MI, you immediately bypass I22 and assign only I21.A1. No exceptions. Even though it happens right smack in the middle of that 4-week window, the clinical nature of demand ischemia completely overrides the category I22 grouping. Don't let that 28-day time frame trick you if the MI type doesn't fit. In medical coding, accuracy isn't just about finding the right code. It's about mathematically proving the timeline, the type, and the reason for admission. If you master the 28-day window, memorize those strict exclusions, and let the sequencing matrix guide your logic, you're going to get it right every single time. By understanding these precise rules, you ensure the patient's clinical picture is perfectly reflected in the data. But honestly, it makes you wonder, what other critical coding timelines are hiding in plain sight, just waiting to trip up your claims? Thanks so much for joining me for Part 14, Decode Healthcare with Harsham.